It is my great pleasure to introduce our first major speaker of the Ideas Festival, and we could not possibly be starting with someone more distinguished and with a message that is more timely. I will not have to tell you much because you have right there in front of you his current title, of course, Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He is the President's Science Advisor. He is familiar to many people in Aspen audiences. Until recently, he was the Teresa and John Heinz Professor at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And of course, he is really one of the most respected voices in the world on climate change, science, and technology related to the environment. We are very, very lucky to have him here, particularly given all that is happening in Congress this past few weeks and what will continue, and I'm sure he will be telling you about that and its significance. It is my great pleasure to present John Holdren. John.
Well, thank you very much, Elliot, and thank you all. I have to say, speaking of things going on in Congress, if the vote had gone the other way on Friday, I would be here in sackcloth and ashes. It is a great pleasure and a privilege to be back at the Ideas Festival. My wife and I love Aspen. We love the Aspen Institute, and we love the Ideas Festival. So I will always say yes when invitations are from this venue. A number of people have said, what are you going to say that's different than last year? And surely you're not going to say any of the same things. But I am an academic, after all, or at least I was an academic for most of my life. And so I can't help but begin with some review. A couple of points from last year's talk before I move on to some additional things. And from last year's talk, really the brief remarks I gave at the Ideas session at the opening of last year's Ideas Festival, the essence of our energy climate predicament, I said then, is that without energy there is no economy, without climate there is no environment, without economy and environment there is no material well-being, there's no civil society, there's no security, national, personal, or international. And the problem is that the world is getting most of the energy its economies need in ways that are wrecking the climate that its environment needs. And that is a big problem. A little bit of further review. It's not global warming. That's a terrible term. It has distorted the debate. That term implies something that's uniform across the planet, that's mainly about temperature, that's gradual, and that's quite possibly benign. That's how most people think of warming. What's actually happening is highly non-uniform geographically. It's not just about temperature, but about extremes, averages, fluctuations in temperature, moisture, rainfall, the whole works. I'll say more about that in a moment. It is rapid compared to the capacity of society for adjustment and compared to the capacity of ecosystems for adjustment. And it is not benign. For most places and most times, it is harmful, and I'll be saying more about that. The last part of the review, the details of why the average temperature, which is how almost everybody characterizes how far along the path we are, is not the whole story. Climate means the patterns of weather, the averages, the extremes, the timing, the spatial distribution of hot and cold, cloudy and clear, humid and dry, how much it rains, snowfall, snowpack, snowmelt, breezes, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and not just the magnitudes, but again, the timing. And when you talk about climate change, what you're talking about is disrupting the patterns. The global average temperature is just an index of the state of the global climate as expressed in those patterns, and small changes in the index mean big changes in the patterns. People who say, well, you know, what's 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit among friends, should ask themselves how you feel when your body temperature goes up 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It is telling you something's wrong, and the temperature of the planet is telling us something is wrong. The main things I'm going to talk about tonight in brief are how we got where we are, where we're headed, and the insights from the current state of climate science about what's already happening in the climate and the harm that is coming from that, and what will happen if we don't change course, and then leading from that into the size of the course change we will need to fix it, and the implications of that for what Congress needs to achieve and for what Copenhagen needs to achieve. And finally, I'll say a few words, of course, about the Obama administration's strategy in relation to these challenges. So how we got here. The 150 years from 1850 to 2000 saw something in excess of a fourfold increase in the world's population, something in excess of a fivefold increase in energy use per person, in combination a 20-fold growth in energy use, nearly all of it coming from the expansion of fossil fuels. From 1850 to 1950, the main driver was the expansion of coal. From 1950 to 2000, at more than twice the growth rate, the main drivers were first oil and then natural gas. And that rapid energy growth and the high fossil fuel dependence have continued in the 21st century. We remain worldwide 80% dependence for all of our energy on the fossil fuels, on coal and oil and natural gas. Continued high growth is projected out to 2030 and, in fact, beyond. We are looking at the prospect of well over a 50% increase in world energy use in that period, a somewhat smaller but not much smaller increase in U.S. energy use in that period, and more than a doubling in Chinese energy use in that period, under business as usual. And under continued business as usual, fossil fuels will continue to dominate the supply. Indeed, under business as usual, fossil fuels will still be providing 2/3 of the world's energy in the year 2050. Coal use for electric power is projected to grow especially rapidly. Today in the United States, we get 50% of our electricity from coal. China gets 70 or 80% of its electricity from coal. China is going to grow the most in absolute terms, but the increase for the world as a whole is staggering when you recognize that these coal-burning power plants are the largest single source of carbon dioxide emissions, the emissions that are disrupting the global climate on the planet. So what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with business as usual? There are a number of reasons to want to change course. Those reasons include rising U.S. oil imports and increasing international competition for oil involving China, the United States, and others. Under business as usual, China will be importing more oil in 2030 than the United States was importing in 2005. There's going to be intense increasing competition for the world's remaining cheap oil supplies on that trajectory. Another reason to change course is the tremendous burdens on conventional air pollution, water pollution, and impacts on ecosystems from fossil fuel harvesting and use. But the most compelling reason, and the reason that requires the fastest, biggest change in course, is the dominant contribution of our fossil-fueled energy system to the disruption of the global climate. Energy accounts for around 70% of the global emissions of the heat-trapping gases and particles that are wrecking the global climate. Turn to the climate science, what's already happening. First of all, climate change is now occurring more rapidly than was predicted previously by almost anybody. Emissions, concentrations, temperatures, both regional and global, and sea level are all rising at rates at or above those of the earlier so-called high scenarios of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We're moving outside the envelope. Significant harm to human well-being is already occurring. This is not just a problem for our children and grandchildren. It is a problem today for many folks around the world. Avoiding dangerous human interference in the climate system, which was the agreed goal of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change when we and 190 other nations ratified it, is no longer within reach. We are already experiencing dangerous human interference in the climate system. The question is whether we will be smart enough to avoid catastrophic interference in the climate system. A little bit of elaboration on this, how fast it's growing. This is a trajectory of the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide from 1850 out to about 2007. And you can see the slope is increasing. It's now increasing in the range of 2 parts per million per year, considerably above where it was in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. Temperature and sea level, not surprising, given those concentration increases, are likewise going up. As I mentioned before, those increases in temperature and in sea level have been at the high ends of the range of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios from just a few years ago. The effects are evident in many different ways, among them the shrinkage of sea ice. 2 images here, sea ice at its minimum in September 2005 and then September 2007. The magenta line is the long-term average of sea ice extent in the period since 1978, when we've been able to monitor that extent from satellites. You see how much it had shrunk from the long-term average in September 2005, catastrophically greater shrinkage in 2007. In 2008, at its annual minimum last year, that was the second smallest ice coverage in modern times. But when you look at the thickness as well as the area, what one discovers is that 2008 was the smallest ice volume in the Arctic in modern times, the smallest ice volume. This is potentially a very serious problem, not because disappearance of the sea ice changes sea level. It does not. The sea ice is floating. And when it melts, just like when ice cubes melt in your drink glass, the level of the drink doesn't go up. Sea level doesn't go up when this stuff melts. But what happens is the reflectivity of the far north changes drastically from the white sea ice, which reflects most of the sunlight that hits it, to dark blue ocean water, which when it's exposed absorbs most of the sunlight that hits it. That drastically changes the energy balance of the far north. That will change the circulation patterns of the whole northern hemisphere if that happens. But melting of land ice, which does affect sea level, is also accelerating. The red areas here show the area of the surface of the Greenland ice sheet that was melted in the peak of the summer melting in each of 3 years, 92, 2002, and 2005. 2005 set, again, a record for modern times, that area of red, the area of melting, and 2007 exceeded 2005 by about 10%. Turning to the harm that's already occurring. Part of that harm is floods and droughts. An example is the weakening East Asia monsoon attributed to global climate change by the Chinese themselves, among others. That has meant less moisture flow in the atmosphere over China from the south to the north. That's produced increased flooding in the south of China, increased drought in the north, already influencing their agricultural productivity, and one of the reasons that the attitudes of the Chinese leadership about this problem have changed drastically over the last few years. Wildfires. Wildfires in the western United States have increased fourfold in the last 30 years, similar trends evident in other fire-prone regions. Climate change, hotter air makes air pollution worse. This is the correlation between temperature and air pollution in the South Coast Air Basin, Los Angeles area. In fact, worldwide, what we are seeing is increases in floods, increases in wildfires, in droughts, in heat waves, in pest outbreaks like those that have devastated the pines over much of Colorado and Alaska, coral bleaching events. The power of typhoons and hurricanes, the strongest ones, has been increasing. The geographic range of tropical pathogens and the vectors that carry them has been expanding. That's what's already happening. Let's take a look at what will happen if business as usual continues. This is, on the left, the black curve, historical trajectory of temperature change worldwide, average global surface temperature, again, just an indicator. And going off in the various colors to the right are the scenarios of the latest study of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The lower gold one is what would happen if we stopped changing the composition of the atmosphere overnight. If we could freeze the composition of the atmosphere where it is today, the temperature would continue to coast up because of inertia in the climate system of the Earth, largely connected with the very large heat capacity of the ocean. The trajectories we would have some possibility of riding along are the colored trajectories higher up in this picture. The one we're on now is pretty much the red one. If you look at that trajectory, you see it cruises through the 2 degrees Celsius increase over 1900 by about 2050. It reaches about 4 degrees Celsius, that is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit above the 1900 figure by 2100. And again, that's the average. In the far north, the temperature increases would be 2 or 3 times that. Central continents, also a multiple of that. And as the slide indicates, the last time the temperature was as high as it will be on business as usual in 2050 was 130,000 years ago. Sea level was 4 to 6 meters higher then than it is today. The last time it was 3 degrees Celsius above 1900 was 30 million years ago in the Eocene. That was a period in which my colleague, the paleoclimatologist Dan Schrag at Harvard, likes to point out there were crocodiles swimming off of Greenland and palm trees in Wyoming. This would be a very different world continuing on that business as usual trajectory. Agriculture is expected to be hardest hit in the tropics. Crop yields in the tropics start dropping when the local temperature increase goes above 1 degree Celsius. Droughts expected to increase dramatically in many parts of the world. All you have to know about this diagram is that the yellow means droughts substantially increased in the middle of this century compared to the end of the last century. The orange means drastically increased. The black means catastrophic. And you see what happened to the Amazon in particular, to southern Africa, southern Europe, Australia, the southwestern United States, and Mexico. This is not a pretty picture. Another thing that will happen, only recently getting attention, is the pickling of the oceans. About a third of the carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere gets taken up in the surface layer of the oceans, about the top 80 meters. That lowers the pH, that is, increases the acidity of the ocean as that dissolved carbon dioxide forms weak carbonic acid. That increased acidity lowers the availability of calcium carbonate to the critters that use calcium carbonate to make their shells or their skeletons, including corals. These 3 maps of the world oceans show the extent to which seawater is satisfactory for coral formation. Green means good, yellow means marginal, red means disastrous. And again, you see where we're headed by the middle of this century. In most of the world's oceans, the water will no longer be hospitable to the support of corals. And by the way, coral reefs, together with the tropical forests, are the 2 largest reservoirs of biodiversity on the planet. So we're going to look at drought in the Amazon and pickling the oceans where the coral reefs live. This, too, is not a pretty picture. Turning to what might happen, what we call tipping points. I mentioned already, if the Arctic sea ice were to disappear entirely and not reform, the climate of the whole northern hemisphere would change drastically. Another potential tipping point, the tundra and the permafrost in the far north are warming and thawing. That has the potential for generating an outpouring of both carbon dioxide and methane. The methane stored in the permafrost and the tundra is 20 times as potent per molecule as carbon dioxide is. This could drastically accelerate the disruption of climate around the world. And another possibility is rapid disintegration of the land ice sheets. We know that 1 to 2 meters per century of sea level rise is possible, and that becomes a practical possibility at temperature increases above about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Nobody knows, nobody can prove with both hands above the table if this will happen at 1.5 or 2 or 2.5. It's out there somewhere, and we're playing a nasty experiment trying to find out. You look at what sea level increase could mean. This is what it could mean where I lived until moving to Washington, D.C., and where Sherry and I still have a home, the Cape Cod and Boston vicinity. This was produced by one of my former graduate students, Jeff Balicki, at the Kennedy School, just animating what sea level rise at 1, 3, 7, 12, 30, and 70 meters does to the coastline of New England. 70 meters is what you'd get if the entire ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica all disintegrated, melted, went into the sea. No one thinks that could happen in a period of less than a few thousand years, but there could be surprises even there. What are our options? There are only 3. Again, I did mention this last year. This, again, is a bit of review. One option is mitigation, the things you do to reduce the pace and the magnitude of the changes in global climate that we're causing. A second option is adaptation, the measures you take to reduce the adverse impacts on human well-being that result from the changes in climate that do occur. And the third option is suffering, suffering the adverse impacts that you fail to avoid by either mitigation or adaptation. Looking at the possibilities for mitigation, certainly we will want to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and black soot from the energy sector, from our cars, from our factories, from our homes, from our two-wheelers. We will want to reduce deforestation, increase reforestation and afforestation, which takes up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We will want to modify our agricultural practices to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, build up soil carbon. Conceivably, we will get desperate enough to engage in geoengineering to create cooling effects to try to offset the greenhouse heating. There are actually some approaches to geoengineering which are clearly advantageous and innocuous. One is changing black roofs to white roofs so that we reflect sunlight in the summer rather than absorbing it. And we may get desperate enough to deploy technologies to scrub greenhouse gases from the atmosphere technologically. Trees do it biologically, but if we can't plant enough trees, we may try to build artificial trees that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to be sequestered in the earth. Lots of possibilities for adaptation as well, changing cropping patterns, developing heat, drought, and salt-resistant varieties of crops, strengthening our defenses against tropical diseases, which will be spreading, building new water projects for flood control and drought management, dikes and storm surge barriers against sea level rise, avoiding further development on floodplains and near sea level. The nice thing about many of these measures is that they are win-win measures. They'd make sense even if you weren't worried about climate change. They should therefore be relatively easy in many cases to get done. Key point is that both are essential. No feasible amount of mitigation can stop climate change in its tracks. Adaptation efforts are already happening. They need to be expanded. But adaptation becomes costlier and less effective as the magnitude of the climatic changes to which you're trying to adapt gets bigger. And therefore, what we need is enough mitigation to avoid unmanageable climate change and enough adaptation to manage the climate change that we are unable to avoid, a mixed strategy. The question then is how much mitigation is enough? Stabilizing the atmosphere at 550 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent gives you about a 50% chance of avoiding a temperature increase greater than 3 degrees Celsius. A few years ago, a great many folks thought that might be good enough. Today, very few specialists think that 3 degrees C would be okay. It looks unlikely that 3 degrees C would be manageable in terms of the magnitude of the changes imposed on the climate system. 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent would give you a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. That would certainly be more prudent. It is no guarantee that we will be okay, that we will be within the manageable range. You need to remember that the changes we are already experiencing, the harm we are already experiencing, is associated with a mere 0.8 of a degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level. 0.8 of a degree is doing all that we are experiencing now, and the question is whether we will be able to stop even below 2. Achieving that, achieving stabilization at 450, requires that global emissions level off by about 2020 and decline thereafter to something in the range of 50% below 2000 emissions by 2050 and continuing declines thereafter. This requires, if one takes into account the virtual impossibility of stopping emissions growth in the developing countries as quickly as we can stop that growth in the industrialized countries, it requires that the industrialized countries level off and start to decline sooner than 2020, by about 2015, and decline thereafter in the industrialized countries to about 80% below our 2000 emissions by the year 2050. And that is the basis for the 80-some% number you see in President Obama's climate change strategy. So Congress and Copenhagen, what's needed from Congress clearly is legislation that will get the United States on a path to level off emissions by 2015, consistent with this 450 part per million target, and decline steadily and indeed quite rapidly after that. What's needed at the Copenhagen Conference, which is a conference of the parties to the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is a global agreement under which developing countries agree to join the industrialized nations on declining emissions trajectories no later than 2025. In other words, the industrialized countries have to peak and start going down by 2015. Developing countries by 2025, the global average, the combination of both, declining after about 2020. And the key point, absolutely key point, is the second thing is not going to happen unless the first thing does. If the United States does not get in place legislation that turns this country, for a long time the largest emitter in the world and now barely in second place to China, from a laggard into a leader in addressing this problem, the rest of the world is not going to go along in Copenhagen, and particularly the major developing countries, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and so on, are not going to agree to start taking serious measures to curb their emissions, to bend their emissions trajectories off of business as usual, unless the United States has demonstrated its willingness and ability to do so. We have to get the bill through the Senate as well as the House if we are to have a reasonable chance of getting the agreement we need in Copenhagen. Finally, to the Obama administration strategy. First part of the strategy is to promote recognition that this is not climate change policy versus the economy, it is climate change policy for the economy. It's pointing out that the costs of action for the United States and for the world will be far smaller than the costs of inaction, the costs of failing to limit climate change to manageable levels. It's a matter of pointing out that we can reduce costly and risky oil imports and dangerous air pollution with the same measures we employ to reduce climate-disrupting emissions. And it's a matter of pointing out that the surge of innovation that we are going to need in clean energy technologies and in energy efficiency will create new businesses and new jobs and will help drive economic recovery, growth, and global competitiveness. We need this innovation for lots of reasons, besides just addressing the climate change danger itself. Next part of the strategy, of course, is to work with the Congress to get comprehensive energy climate legislation that will put the United States on the needed emissions trajectory with minimum economic and social cost and maximum co-benefits. The Waxman-Markey bill that passed barely last Friday is not all that I would wish for. It's not all that many of you who follow this would wish for. It has many shortcomings, but it is much, much better than nothing. If that bill had gone down to defeat, it would be a blow around the world seen as a U.S. vote against the reality and urgency of climate change. It would be seen as a further expression of U.S. unwillingness to lead in addressing this problem, unwillingness to do the single most important thing that we need to do, which is to put a price on the greenhouse gas emissions that are disrupting the climate in order to create the incentives that will unleash the ingenuity to figure out how to reduce those emissions in ways that are cost-effective and indeed in many cases make money. So notwithstanding that that bill is not in its current form all that we would like, all that we might wish for, all that we might need, it is a start we can work with, and I hope we will be able to improve it in the Senate and in conference committee. The next element of the strategy is to work with the other major emitting countries, both industrialized and developing, to build cooperation in developing and deploying the clean technologies that we're going to need and in promoting both individual and joint climate policies that are consistent with this absolute necessity of avoiding unmanageable climate change. Just one closing observation. On this and all of the other national and global challenges where science and technology matter, both for understanding the problem and for supplying major elements of the solution. There are a lot of such problems. Other issues besides climate in the domain of resources and environment, including water, sustainable agriculture, and many others. Biomedicine and health, figuring out how to get better outcomes for all Americans at lower costs. technological innovation across a wide range of domains: information technology, communications technology, biotech, green tech, and so on, innovation for productivity and growth, science, technology, engineering, and math education, national and international security. On all of these challenges, it is a huge asset and a huge opportunity to have a president who both gets it and can explain it. Thank you very much.